Hello, and welcome to Revolutionary Ideas, the monthly Marxist podcast from Socialist Alternative. As Marxists, we follow the example set by the Russian Revolution of 1917. This was the greatest event in human history, a milestone in the fight for a world liberated from oppression, exploitation, and war. But we're also told lots of lies about what the revolution was. We're told lies about what it represented. So to go through many of these ideas, along with our regular panellists Connor and Yara, we're also joined this month by two members of the International Socialist Alternative in Russia, Rob and Lilly. Over to you four.
Today we're going to be talking about how did the Bolsheviks defend the Russian Revolution. Of course, it's a very significant event, the Russian Revolution, one that we talk about a lot and we'll have mentioned on this podcast on a number of occasions. And it's one where there's a lot of different ideas about how events went down, what role the Bolsheviks played, and how we want to appraise people like Lenin. So this is what we're going to be discussing today. And I think a good place to start really would be this question about what did the Russian Revolution represent? Why did the Bolsheviks even see it as something that they had to defend? What was so important and worth defending about what was achieved in the Russian Revolution?
To start with something, 1917 in Russia turned out to be really long. So in the words of Marx, these days concentrated like a 10 year in 1 year. So the February Revolution overthrew the Russian autocracy. So I think that it was the most the strongest autocracy in the world in these years. So February Revolution was point, maybe a signal that autocracies can be broken and so on. And after it, the October Revolution was 10 days that shocked the world and did away with the capitalism and so on. So yes, Russian Revolution represented, firstly in the world, represented that it is really possible in real life to break autocracies and to take power in hands of workers and students. Maybe Rob will add something.
Well, I think that Lily was right because it wasn't one revolution in 1917, but two. Why did we need two? In many countries like Britain and so on, in France, other countries, you had a revolution that initially put into power the capitalist class. And in a certain period of time, it was progressive in the sense that it united the nation, it reformed land, it introduced elements of parliamentary democracy. But when the capitalist class in February of 1917 had their revolution, they didn't do any of this. They were too weak. They were incapable. They were too afraid of the working class and the peasantry. And so, in effect, they didn't fully break with the autocracy. They tried to maintain links with it and so on and so forth. And so it needed the second revolution to introduce land reform, to give land to the peasantry. It needed a second revolution to introduce democratic rights. It needed the second revolution to give national determination to countries like Finland, to Poland, to Estonia, and to other countries and so on. And of course, it needed a second revolution to introduce a Soviet democracy where workers had control of the factories and control of the economy.
Yeah, and I think this is really interesting because a lot of the time I think we forget there's another revolution that happened in the same year. But I wanted to ask, before we get to talking about the two revolutions, why was a revolution even needed? Because I think a lot of people talk about kind of the Russian Revolution as a coup. Do you think that it was a coup? Do you, like what about it was a revolution? And I think another thing that I find really interesting in the context of 1917 is that we're talking about the First World War. right? Like, so how does something like that even happen in the duration of a war, of a massive war, the biggest war up until that point in time?
Well, a revolution was necessary because there was no democracy in Russia at all. For example, you had a parliament where for every, I think it was every 10,000 workers, you had one MP, but for every 100 landlords, you had one MP. I have the figures are wrong, but that was the sort of thing that happened. You had an autocracy that was prepared to use troops to put down any movement towards democracy. We see the same today in Myanmar. We see the same today in Belarus. We see the same today in a whole number of countries. The autocracy is not prepared to allow ordinary people to take control. Therefore, you have to have a revolution. And a revolution doesn't have to be violent. February, there was, because of the spontaneous nature, a number of people were killed during the events, both in Petrograd and particularly in Moscow. But in relation to how many were killed in the war, of course, it was a very, very small group. But in the October Revolution, which was organized, which was conscious, there were very, very few injuries and people killed because it was disciplined. And the people that were killed by the reaction who were trying to defend their rule against the democratic masses.
I mean, it's been mentioned, this idea of the Russian Revolution being a coup, but the slogan that the revolution was built on was not all power to the Bolshevik Party, it was all power to the Soviets. And it was a situation where, far from kind of autocratic dictatorship replacing the Tsar's regime and replacing the provisional government after the February Revolution, you actually had working class people themselves in power, in democratic control, in the driving seat, fighting their own oppression. And on that basis, you know, national minorities, women, LGBTQ plus people and so on were able to win huge advances and gains in their rights that you hadn't seen anywhere else in the world, and that we're still in many ways catching up with 100 years later. But I think another point about this that it might be interesting for some others to come in on is that this wasn't just something that they did on a national basis. This wasn't what they just thought was the way forward for Russia. They saw this as an international revolution. And that was absolutely central both to the goals of the revolution itself, but also, I think, the other aspects of this question about how they defended the revolution and why they defended the revolution, this internationalist perspective. So maybe someone wants to come in on that as well.
I guess that now we're concentrated on the international questions and working in international organization because we know that not international socialism is not a true socialism, and that Soviet Union when Stalin decided to build his own socialism, which is not socialism, in only one country, so it was his mistake. We see that it isn't possible to build a socialism in one or two or a group of countries. So that's why we need and we work in the international and see international perspectives.
If I can add a bit to that as well, and we have to be clear that whatever people said in history afterwards, the leaders of the Bolshevik Revolution always saw it as an international revolution. Actually, they thought that it would be difficult to build socialism in Russia as one country because it was so backward, because of the peasantry. They wanted the revolution to be developed in Germany, in France, in Britain, and of course in America as well. And even today, we have the same problem. How can the people in Hong Kong and Myanmar fight for their rights and gain a democratic solution if they're not prepared to fight together with the masses in China to overthrow the Chinese autocracy? How can the people in Belarus get democracy if they're not linked up with democratic movements in Russia, in Poland, and in other countries? And it happens all over the world now that everything is so interrelated There is no national solution to the problems we have. The climate change is an international solution. COVID is an international solution, and we have to be an international on that basis. And that's what Lenin and Trotsky fought for all the way through until they died.
We were talking a little bit about kind of the context, the international context that was happening at the time, and the fact that the entire world was fighting at the time. And I think that kind of analysis of socialism that saw the fighting and the extreme level of conflict and pointed that it's not different nations that are fighting each other, it's different capitalists with different interests fighting each other, and that the interests of the working class are to unite internationally is extremely important. And also I think kind of the main highlights that we need to take when we look at the Russian Revolution as kind of like, you know, history for us as activists today. I think you made really, really good kind of comparisons, Rob. And I wanted to ask, because we're talking a lot about kind of the background to the revolution. We're talking about kind of, you know, what it represented, also the fact that it did kind of, you know, start a wave of revolutions, not just in Russia. But I want to know, because we can talk a lot about kind of the theory behind it, why we needed international, but how did they actually do it? What actually happened in the revolution that kind of brought it into a place of internationalism, but also kind of how they defended that revolution? Like, what did they actually do?
Yes, I think because if you look at what happened at the beginning of 1917, the Bolsheviks were a minority. They had probably several thousand people in Petrograd, in Moscow, and across the Russian Empire. They had broken with the international movement in the sense that the international social democracy, particularly in Germany, but in France, in Britain, and other countries, had supported their own capitalist class in the First World War. And the Bolsheviks never did that. They always fought against the Russian imperialists. So they started off as a minority. And two things played in their favor. First of all, I suppose a negative feature is that the other parties, the liberals and the reformists in Russia, were incapable of answering the needs of the masses. And the second thing is that the Bolsheviks were able to take the mood of the masses and to crystallize it into simple slogans: bread, land, and peace. Bread for the workers, land for the peasants, peace for the soldiers. And that helped to mobilize the masses. And through the course of the year, some of the period of which was very, very difficult, Lenin had to go into hiding. There was a huge witch hunt against the Bolsheviks in the summer of 1917 to drive them underground and so on. Trotsky was arrested and so on. That very, very quickly, the masses saw that the old parties were incapable and only the Bolsheviks had an answer to take society forward. And they were prepared to defend it to the end in order to deliver the goods that they'd promised.
Yes, I think that's exactly right, and hugely important part of this question of how did they go about defending the revolution. One of the other aspects that I think is really important as a part of how they did it was, of course, domestically they did have to get organised against the capitalists who were themselves getting organised to try and take power back into their own hands. They certainly kind of didn't willingly just come out of power and allow the Bolsheviks to take their place, to allow the Soviets to gain control over society. And so they, immediately started organising for the overthrow of the Soviet power, of these democratic councils of workers that were managing society. And as part of this, the Bolsheviks began organising their own defence. They organised the Red Army, and of course were plunged into a kind of civil war situation by these attempts of the capitalists to regain their power. So I guess a question that we might want to discuss is, how was the Red Army organised? How was that different maybe to what we've seen in kind of armies under capitalism, the kind of armies that we might think of as invading other countries? or kind of repressing movements like we've seen in many parts of the world, in Myanmar, for instance, at the moment. Was the Red Army just a continuation of this, or was it something maybe a bit different?
We've just talked about internationalism of the revolution. Let's talk about what the Bolsheviks did when they came to power. They came to power towards the end of October, beginning of November, depending on what calendar you use. Within a year, they had started to reform the medical system. They introduced education. Lilly will confirm this, but in the course of the last 2 or 3 years, a whole number of universities, and I'm talking about dozens of universities across Russia, have had their 100-year anniversaries. They were set up in the 5 years after 1917 by the Bolsheviks. You had new rights for women. You had an end to criminalization of the LGBT community. There were even leading Bolsheviks who were gay activists, one of whom became an ambassador in London for a period. And it was a completely different society that was a threat to capitalism across the world. And the capitalists knew that, and they mobilized. It wasn't a civil war where there were two groups within Russia who suddenly started fighting each other. It was an international war to put down the revolution. I know that because my great-grandfather was a postal trade unionist in London. And at the end of the war, they tried to send him to Murmansk as a soldier to fight the revolution. And he and some of his comrades organized a protest, and they weren't sent in the end. But the British, the Americans, the Japanese, the Germans, every country, the Czechs, they all sent troops in to try and put down the revolution. They linked up with the white armies, the reactionary generals, Tsarists, the monarchists, and so on. And why did the Bolsheviks win the Civil War? Not because they had better weapons, not because they had more men fighting on their side. And actually, that's the wrong word, because there were a lot of women fighting in the Red Army as well, which didn't happen in the other armies across during the Civil War. It's because the Bolsheviks had the right approach, the right answer. The peasantry knew that if the Bolsheviks won, they would get the land. If the White Army won, the landlords would re-establish control. The same with the national minorities. If the Bolsheviks win, the national minorities could gain independence. If the White Army won, there would be one unified and unbreakable Russia. That was the call of the White Guards and so on. So it was two-sided. There was a military aspect to it, but there was also a political aspect to it. And that's how the Red Army were able to defeat these 22 foreign armies that intervened into Russia.
Yeah, and I think what you're saying, Rob, is really incredible to think about the kind of threat that this revolution posed. And I think now, in kind of historic retrospect, we understand the reason why the capitalists were kind of mobilized en masse against this. But I also think that it's important to kind of look at the criticism even from the left against the revolution, because we're talking a lot about kind of the way that the capitalists treated it. But today the left is kind of presenting it a lot of the time as kind of like reactionary. I know, obviously, I'm from Israel, and I like the curriculum in Israel, obviously not left, but keeps criticizing the Bolsheviks for being anti-Semitic, saying that they were anti-Semitic, whereas the reality of things is completely the opposite. We were seeing in that period so many pogroms, so much racism generally, repression generally, and anti-Semitism in particular, where the Bolsheviks were actually fighting against it. And we were seeing kind of like even fascist elements that were kind of going against the revolution as well. So what do you think about this? Like, because we're talking about kind of a situation where you had all of these imperialist countries fighting against the revolution, but then criticisms also from the left. So how do you think that kind of sits together?
Well, it is an interesting question. I guess in all times and centuries, how should different parts of left people sit together? I guess that it is very important to understand that to respect the historical truth and to tell it, to speak about it, to speak about our history, and it is very important to, I guess, to understand that in the future there will be some days and some revolutionary days when we will need to decide something really fast, not only to think about our political positions, but to speak with our comrades, with our contacts, with people who are interested in our organization, in our position, in our statements, and so on. So I guess that in some questions we need to have our one position and to speak about it with anyone who is interested in it. So maybe Rob will add something.
There's a lot of lefts who can criticize, but in a situation you have to act. And the Bolsheviks wanted peace. They wanted an end to the war. They did so. They signed the peace treaty with Germany. They did, and in doing so, they gave up part of Ukraine and they gave up part of the Caucasus region as well. And they were not the ones who started the civil war. The civil war was started from outside. Now, if you are attacked, if you are a striker, and you're attacked by the police or by strike breakers or right-wing thugs on a picket line, you don't sit back and say, "Okay, I'm against violence." You defend yourself. And sometimes, as we know in the past, that defense has had to be quite rigid, quite brutal. Now, after the revolution, you have the civil war. The Bolsheviks and the working class had to defend the revolution. And it was pretty horrific. The fighting that took place in some areas was absolutely horrific. And there was famine as well across whole parts of Russia as a result of the war. So it was a very nasty time. But those people that say the Bolsheviks are anti-Semite, for example, they're confusing a period. The Bolsheviks are not anti-Semite. The Bolsheviks fought for the rights of the Jewish people just as they fought for the rights of all other peoples. It was Stalin and the degeneration of the revolution that brought in anti-Semitism. And I can just give one example. That some lefts like to criticize the Bolsheviks for setting up the Cheka, the extraordinary commission that then became, under Stalin, it became a horrific monster, became known as the KGB that still exists in reality in Russia and in Belarus and so on. But the Cheka was first set up in Petrograd in order to fight Jewish pogroms in Ukraine, because they were being organized by the right wing, and the Cheka was there to try and undermine the people that were organizing the pogroms. So we can see that you have to look at, as Lily has just said, you have to look at historical truth and what actually happened. And we have to restore that historical truth in a lot of cases and explain what the Bolsheviks did. And unfortunately, what happened when the revolution degenerated a lot later.
So yeah, I think it's important that we also talk about the fact that there were people who resisted the revolution. There weren't just, the capitalists. There were peasant rebellions, like Kronstadt, I think the most famous one of them. But what do you think is the answer? Why is this violence necessary?
Well, the peasant rebellions, they were not as widespread as is sometimes put out, but nevertheless they were serious, and they were a reflection of the fact that destruction caused by the First World War and then the Civil War, which of course, if you fight in 22 armies across the whole of the Russian Empire, you're gonna have some real problems over the whole of the country in terms of destruction of land and industry and so on. So they were a reflection of the real hardships that were taking place. There was real famine. And in fact, the Bolsheviks never hid that. There was an international campaign to send humanitarian aid to help out the starving peasants and so on, which didn't happen, of course, later under Stalin, when there was a much, much worse famine caused by his mistakes. And the peasant uprisings and Kronstadt were really a reflection of that. And it was a very, very difficult period. And actually, it led the Bolsheviks to have to change tack. They were waiting for an international revolution, which unfortunately didn't take place in Germany, although it could have done. There was all the conditions there for a revolution. So they then had to change tack. They had to liberalize the regime and so on for a period in the hope that a new revolution would develop. And then, of course, you began to see an easing of the problems of food and so on. So it was a genuine, there was a really bad objective situation facing them that wasn't helped out by the failure of revolution elsewhere. And in that situation, of course, things happen that certainly in hindsight we would try and avoid.
We should understand that after revolution, capitalists will not just put their money, houses, planes, and so on, and just, oh, take it. Oh, you made a great revolution. This is the price. No, they will try to protect their capital, and so people who for a lot of years see them like an idols and ideal people with a lot of money, cars, planes, ships, and so on. Some of them can just go after capitalists to protect their capital.
Of course, Kronstadt was more than just a bad thing. It was necessary. It was a necessary evil at the time. But obviously, in the future, we would hope that we can build a strong international so that we can avoid leaving a revolution isolated in a country. I suppose the analogy at the moment is the situation is facing workers and youth in Myanmar. They're facing a horrific military dictatorship. We have an interview on our site by a leader of the trade unions in Myanmar this week. And she's explaining how many workers have had to go into hiding. They've had to leave, they've left it, they've been driven out of the factories and so on. The reality of it is many youth have joined up into militias because they see that as the only way to fight back against the military regime. Of course, we don't think that's enough. We think you have to have a political campaign and based around the organized working class in order to fight the regime. But you see that people are put in this situation, they have no alternative but to resist. And so those that talk about violence, they have to see where the violence comes from. It comes from the capitalists, it comes from the state, it comes from the military and from the authoritarian regime. And if we have to defend ourselves to resist that, then, well, we'll have to do that.
I agree with what people have said really here, and it is always worth bearing in mind the stakes that were at play here. What would have happened if the counter-revolution against the Soviets, against the Bolsheviks, had been victorious? It would have been pogroms, it would have been severe repression, the execution of at least the leaders of the revolution. But many bourgeois historians look at the violence in the Civil War on the side of the revolution with horror, but totally gloss over the much more serious violence, the anti-Semitism, and so on of the counter-revolutionary forces. And I think it was Trotsky himself who made the point that if the Bolsheviks had failed, we would be using a Russian word for fascism rather than an Italian one, because that would be where that kind of repression, that kind of authoritarianism would have come up first historically, not in Italy but in Russia, in the power that overthrew or would have overthrown the Bolsheviks. But that's very different. This stuff that we're talking about here to what we've talked about that came later, the rise of Stalinism, the oppressive authoritarian regime that kind of usurped the Bolsheviks and the rule of the workers' councils, these Soviets. And we would say that wasn't something that was kind of inevitable, something that was bound to take place. So how did we get from this situation where you had a democratic workers' state and one that clearly did have to defend itself against serious threats, to one that was employing a brutal regime that repressed the working class themselves, that actually did that did kill a lot of people in utterly kind of barbaric ways, imprisoned a great many more.
It is a really interesting question how Stalinism appeared. I guess there are a lot of factors. To begin with, of course, we should talk about his idea of Stalinism in one country. So I guess that, of course, we should say that really a lot of factors, maybe a lot of accidents like the death of Lenin, Stalin understood that now or never. So he just catches a moment and to take power in his hands. And of course, we should speak and about Stalinism, about with our maybe contacts or with just ordinary people, that Stalinism wasn't socialism, because for example, in our schools in Russia, teachers are sure that Stalinism is socialism, and it is really bad, because after it, after these points of view, people think that socialism is against women, against LGBT, and socialism just like Stalinism, but with iPhones and in 21st century. So we should pay attention of our social medias, of our contacts and of our comrades, that there is a big difference between real socialism and the ideas of Trotsky and Stalinism, and his power, his autocracy, his idea of one country socialism, which is not socialism. I guess this is really important for us. Maybe Rob will add something.
I think Lily made an important point here. The difference between what we had in the Soviet Union and what was meant by the Bolsheviks was summed up in this dispute between Lenin and Trotsky. Not because they're two different people, but because they represented different objective situations. Trotsky was the, if you like, the inheritor of the Bolshevik ideal of a socialist democratic state that would be internationalist, where you would have, as Lily has just said, you would have rights for women, you would have freedom for LGBT, you would have national independence if countries wanted it. You would have workers' control in the factories, and in fact, you would have democratic management at every level of society, far, far more than you have in a capitalist democracy today. Now, that was Trotsky. Stalin, on the other hand, was a reflection of backward reaction. Because the revolution didn't extend into Germany and elsewhere, you had, after the Civil War, when everything was destroyed, when the working class was not just tired, many of them had been killed in the war, or they'd been pulled into doing other jobs and so on. So the workers' democracy that existed had been pushed right back. And in that situation, you had a new layer of society came to the top, this bureaucratic elite, many of whom were former Tsarist bureaucrats, and they started to implement their reactionary ideas. They reneged on the Bolshevik idea that a man and a woman were equal, not just economically, but before the law. There was no restriction on divorce, for example. You didn't have to get married under the Bolshevik ideas. Under Stalinism, they restored the family. The man is in charge. The woman has to obey the man, and that still exists in Russia today. The man owns the woman. Putin actually says it's okay if the man beats the woman up, as long as he doesn't do it more than once a year. That's just ordinary family relationships and so on. So Stalinism was a reflection of all the reaction from the past that wouldn't have happened if there'd been a spread of the revolution internationally. But because it didn't happen, Stalinism came to the fore. And of the people that you spoke about who were imprisoned, who were murdered by Stalin, the vast majority of those were Bolsheviks, were supporters of the Bolshevik ideal. In order for Stalin to rule the Soviet Union, he had to destroy all those that had the Bolshevik idealism in their heads.
Yeah, I always find it kind of ridiculous when people come and kind of point fingers at us and say they'll and say things about Stalin, because, like you said, Rob, if we were working and people who are, you know, part of our tradition who were working at the time were kind of put in the prisons, were put in the gulags and were assassinated by Stalin, and I think that is kind of all the things that Lily and Rob, all the things that you said, I think are really, really kind of crucial to understand that when we talk about the Russian Revolution, when we talk about defending it, we're not talking about defending those ideas that came after. We're talking about defending true socialism, socialism that is part of our tradition and is part of the tradition of the working class, not part of kind of this oppressive and repressive form of government that developed with the rise of Stalinism and the bureaucracy. So I think this was a really, really interesting discussion. I know I learned a lot about you know, this really interesting historical period that is definitely not spoken enough about, especially not from a perspective of, you know, activists on the ground who are working towards socialism and working towards a revolution that would, you know, end in a successful solution for working class people and kind of toppling down capitalism and class society in the system that's oppressing us. So thank you so much for being here, and I'll just remind all of our listeners that we are, like I said so many times, we are part of this tradition still. We are still working to get there. So please go to our website. It will all be linked in the description for this podcast, and join us no matter where you are in the world. Join our struggle, because we're part of International Socialist Alternative. There's an international organization that has sections all around the world. So please go to our website and either make a donation or join us, which is the best way to kind of defend the ideas of the revolution that we talked about today. So thank you so much, Lily and Rob, and hopefully see you soon.
Thank you for tuning in to this month's episode of Revolutionary Ideas. Make sure you follow us to tune in for next month, where we'll be having a special episode hosted by our new Socialist Feminist Alternative banner. Thanks for listening. See you then.